Dr. Sudhakar Art and Photography. Today we'll do a landscape with watercolor. In the first tutorial we did discuss the materials that we need and the techniques that we need to understand to do a watercolor painting. But this is the second tutorial where we'll do a proper landscape. But the focus of the landscape is going to be the tree. But before we start painting, we need to analyze the tree. Not as a botanist, but as an artist, to understand how sunlight falls on the tree and how that sunlight gets distributed right throughout the tree, because that's what gives the tree its shape and form. So let's begin. Rather than jump into painting a tree, it's important that we kind of analyze and understand how sunlight falls on a tree. So that's what we'll take a look at now. This is a typical English oak tree with the sunlight being somewhere overhead. And if you look very closely, it's not just a splash of green. It's actually got three different shades on the tree. The outer edges of the branches will have the very light shade where sunlight directly falls, and as sunlight creeps into the next level, it creates another shade, and then deep down it gets darker. So basically we have three shades. It's got the highlights, the mid-tones and the dark tones. Now let's look at this in a little more in detail. If you see very closely, the outermost edge of the branch is the highlights, that's where sunlight directly falls on the leaves, and this area is lightest, and let's call it the highlights. And then as sunlight seeps into the tree, it creates a kind of mid-tone, and then as it goes further it gets darker, and then below the branches you have the dark tones. Now, why is this important to understand? Because when we create a tree using watercolor painting, we're going to articulate these three shades. We're going to create the light shades, and then we're going to create the mid-tones, and then finally we're going to create the dark tones. Remember, in watercolor paintings we start from light shades and we get progressively move on to the dark shades. So that's how it works in watercolor. So that is the reason why we need to understand the existence of these three shades. The problem is when we normally look at a tree, we don't realize that there are three shades. But when we take a closer look, then we understand it's not just green everywhere, but there are these three shades. So when we start painting, we have to keep this in mind and work on these three shades so we can create the image of a tree. Let's begin the painting. As you can see, I have stuck the watercolor paper on four sides with masking tape. And let's look at the brushes that I'm going to use now. The standard watercolor brush, the 1-inch brush, and a thin brush. Predominantly I'm going to use these. Then of course a pencil and an eraser. And then of course the paint cakes that I have shown in tutorial 1. And then of course the two bowls of water. And of course the hairdryer for quickly drying the painting. I'm going to start off with a pencil sketch. I'm using the light pencil that I've shown, and I'm just making the simple outline for the tree. I've first divided the paper into 2/3 for the sky. Now I'm drawing the trunks, a few branches, and I'll also demarcate the outline for the branches. After which I'm using the 1-inch brush to apply some water across the area of the sky, and I'm using phthalo blue to gently spread the area of the sky. So I'm using all the techniques that I discussed in tutorial 1. So the paint stays in the area where I applied the water. So I apply water first and then spread the paint across. I'm not using any even strokes here. I'm just dabbing the paint to make it look natural. I'm also leaving that space in between for the branches where I don't want the blue to be there. So I'm just leaving it empty, and just the areas around the tree is now being covered with the light blue. And quickly drying it with the hairdryer. The reason is when I paint the branches, I don't want that green to spread into the sky area. So I want to keep that area different. A little bit of hand tissues to wipe your brushes clean before you change colors. So I'm shifting from the blue to green now, so I clean the brush before that. And I'm starting off with the highlights at this point. As you can see, I'm using the 1-inch brush to generally spread water first in the area of the branches. And once I have sufficient water there, I'm using sap green, very light. This is now the highlights that we discussed. So as we mentioned, as we have understood in watercolor, first do the light shades, progressively move on to the darker shades. So that's what we're doing. We're doing the light shades first. You don't do in the reverse as far as watercolor is concerned. So start with the highlights. I'm just spreading that light paint in the areas where I have demarcated the branches with my pencil. So that's what I'm doing here. It's not a very done very carefully. It's just spreading the paint. So it should be very easy for you to duplicate and try. All you need to do is imagine how those highlights will look when you complete the painting. So that's what an artist needs to do. You have to look ahead and see that completed picture before you actually complete it. That's important. So I can see the areas of the branches where the highlights have been spread. And now I've started off with the mid-tones. I've taken some viridian green and I'm applying it just a little below the areas where I've applied the highlights. So what we are essentially doing here is each cluster of branch, because when you see a tree, you obviously see different clusters of branches. For each cluster, I'm applying the mid-tones just below the highlights. So I'm going to continue this process right through the area of the branches. Just showing you a different view of my painting. Just continuing with this process of applying the mid-tones. So what you need to remember at this stage is make sure the highlights are visible at the outer edges of each cluster of the branch. So your mid-tones come just below the highlights. The highlights must be visible. So you don't cover the highlights entirely with mid-tones, but you place the mid-tones just a layer below the highlights. So that's the process I'm doing here. I'm just continuing with that. So right through this painting of the tree, you have to remember those light shades, mid-tones and dark tones. That's the unavoidable mantra that you need to remember when you draw a tree like this. And if you've seen an oak tree, particularly in summer, it's got very thick foliage. The leaves, it's packed with leaves. So that's the effect that I'm trying to create here. I'm starting off with the dark tones, which are again just below the mid-tones. So I'm following the same order. The outer edges are the highlights, following which I did the mid-tones, and just below the mid-tones I'm now dabbing a little bit of darker shade of green. So I've essentially taken viridian green, mixed it with a little bit of sap green and added just a tinge of black to darken the whole mix. And now I'm applying this just below the mid-tones. I've adjusted the contrast a little bit here to show you distinctly those different shades. I'm continuing this process to make sure I complete all the clusters of branches and leaves to get the form of the tree in shape. Right, so at this point I'm going to increase the shade a wee bit here for the darker tones. You can see that distinctly. The dark tone is just standing out, and it's got really dark because I've used the darker green shades with a very small quantity of black just to make it sufficiently dark. So as you can see here, I'm doing the base of each of those clusters, and I'm dabbing very small calculated quantity of the dark shade. So I'll continue this process until I'm satisfied that I have covered each of those clusters with the 3 shades. So this comes with practice, because you need to imagine the tree there on your paper, and then you have to just go about applying those 3 shades. And the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And finally you'll do a splendid job of painting a tree. So that's the total base of the tree, where it's obviously going to be very dark. That's towards the bottom right of the tree itself. So I'm kind of happy that I have all the shades in place, more or less. We have the branches now complete, the clusters, leaves and branches complete. I'm just giving the final touches of the dark shades there. Now once I complete this, I will start working on the trunk of the tree. So basically, in summary, I've highlighted, I've mixed these 3 shades, started off with the highlights, midtones and then the dark, and I've more or less completed the branches and the leaves. Just blending things a bit here, because you have applied 3 layers, and sometimes you need to use just a wet brush, not very wet, just a mildly wet brush to just blend the areas together to make them look natural. That's what we're doing here now. So we're all set to start the trunk, the main trunk, and a little bit of branches at this point. So I'm using Van Dyck brown, that's what they call it, with a mix of a drop of black here to darken that right side of the trunk, because in this picture, obviously, as you can see, the sunlight is from the top left, so I'm keeping the right side of the trunk darker and the left side of the trunk lighter. And I'll continue to give those finishing touches, a little bit of branches that you can see through the leaves, and if you watch closely you can see that I've deliberately left a little gap somewhere in the center of the tree where you can actually see the sky through the gaps of those branches. So right now I'm adding a little bit of small branches that normally stick out in an oak tree, and basically giving those finishing touches a little bit of I've started off with the grassland here. So from the sky and the tree we have come down to the level of the grass and a little bit of foreground grass as well. Once that's done, I will give a little bit of foreground interest here with a little bit of grass or a tiny shrub, and then start working on the fence as well. There you can see the shadows. Based on the position of the sun, we need to give a shadow of the tree. That just increases the depth of the painting. It's all about light and shades at the end of the day, so you have to know the flow of light and mark those shadows, which is what I've done here. And for the shadows, I'm using a little bit of grey mixed with the green, just to give it that shadowy look. And there you have the completed image, the tree with the background of the grassland and the little fence. I hope you enjoyed this session. Do practice whatever we have seen in the video today. It is quite easy, but it does take a little bit of practice to do the light tones, the mid tones and the dark tones, and get everything into one shape. Everything requires practice, so do be patient and do practice this technique, and I'm sure you can